Well, it's time to take a closer look at something that happened in the news this past Friday. I'm sure you know what it was because there was a big outage. No, I'm not talking about the one from Azure. I'm talking about a misconfigured update to a popular security platform known as Crowdstrike that managed to take down over 8 million Windows PCs and servers. The issue caused the target system to halt and then refuse to boot. Affected entities included multiple airlines, healthcare systems, and the Starbucks Order Ahead app, which personally impacted my family. Fixes were developed and put into play, but initially they required a reboot into safe mode or mounting an image on a new system to remove the offending file, which pretty much ground AWS to a halt over the weekend as people tried to get their servers back online. CrowdStrike CEO released a statement that was not well received, and that could have something to do with the fact that back when he was the CTO at McAfee, back in about 2010, the same thing happened to McAfee. Now, remember that this affected Windows PCs, right? So what was Microsoft's take on this whole CrowdStrike news? Was it a promise to do better in the future? Was it a call for better transparency about Windows applications? No. They're blaming the EU for requiring them to allow third-party programs to run at the kernel level. They're pointing all the way back to a 2009 agreement that forced Microsoft to allow third parties to run with the same permissions as Microsoft products, as opposed to a company like Apple, which regulates kernel access more strictly. There is a lot to unpack in this whole story, whether it's the CrowdStrike part or the Microsoft part, or even the fact that we recently found out that CrowdStrike didn't do any canary tests. They just ran this code through a validator. It said yes, and they pushed it out and said YOLO. Stephen, where do you want to start with this?
Well, I guess first off, I guess I picked the wrong week to not be on the rundown. Um, no, it's funny. So people are saying, some years feel like weeks and some weeks feel like years. Well, this has been a year. Um, yeah, CrowdStrike. I was actually on vacation. I was affected by this myself, which it was incredible to walk through the terminal and see blue screens all around me and see people lining up for boarding using iPads and iPhones instead of the regular terminals. All sorts of things like that was happening. I should mention that technically this is not a blue screen of death. It was a different blue screen, but come on, people, who cares? Point is, the software update caused PCs to halt and not work anymore, which, to a layperson is pretty much a BSOD. The fixes were simple, but as you point out, the underlying problem was that essentially CrowdStrike pushed this out without any kind of staging or testing or anything. They just ran it through their validator. The validator said yes. And within 90 seconds, I think, the first customers were impacted by this. And within an hour or so, it was rippling across the world in every industry, which just shows how susceptible we are to damage. I think my initial take on this was, oh boy. As a Linux user and believer, I see a bunch of people sort of dancing on the grave and saying, haha, that's what you get for using Windows. Oh, no, no, no. This could have been us. This could have been any of us. The same kind of problem could theoretically have affected Linux machines, Macs, even the mainframe, because essentially we're all relying on service providers to do proper testing and validation of their software. And many of us blindly push those new updates into production, especially when it comes to security. I think we should point out that the reason that CrowdStrike continually pushes these updates to all of their clients is because they are constantly fighting to keep those systems secure. And they have to be pushing stuff out continually. Honestly, if you are waiting to apply security updates or vulnerability patches on critical infrastructure until a day, a week, a month after they're issued, that's going to be a serious security issue. In other words, we all have to trust companies like CrowdStrike to do the right thing for our systems. Unfortunately, in this case, they didn't. Now, there's a whole bunch of things to unpack, but Tom, I know you talked about this last week. Am I off base here in saying that this was kind of inevitable and we really do have to trust companies like CrowdStrike?
Oh, you're absolutely not wrong on that at all, Stephen. One of the things that we've seen over the years is that the more insidious that malware writers get, the more creative we have to be on the ways to combat them. I mean, if you remember back to the Kaseya hack that happened, what, a couple of years ago, they were literally using Microsoft Defender to deploy their malware. Like that was like that was the kind of ingenious malicious part of it, was that they were literally using the anti-malware system of Windows to do the work for them. So, CrowdStrike works because it runs at the kernel level. Like, it is able to examine files and halt the system from booting if it's infected. You want that. Like, that is a big deal. And the problem, of course, is that what happens when that system gets compromised? Going back to Kaseya, what happens when your software delivery system is the thing that's compromised, not the userland applications? Well, you just basically keep getting malware delivered to you over and over again. And I mean, the number of systems that were impacted. So we use Macs here at the Rundown. So I wasn't affected. I could wake up on Friday morning and boot my system just fine. But applications that I use maybe weren't working because they require a Windows backend authentication, or they were running on Azure, which kind of had its own problems. But the thing that people need to understand is that it was all interconnected. Like, for example, here's a fun one that I literally found out about yesterday by listening to NPR, where our good friend Tim Crawford was interviewed on All Things Considered. Major airlines recovered relatively quickly for airlines, which means it still took a few hours for them to get back up and running, except for Delta. Delta took a lot longer to come back online. In fact, as of yesterday, they were still canceling a ton of flights. And one of the reasons why was, believe it or not, because it sounds like Delta was more security conscious than other companies, which means that they enabled BitLocker encryption on all of their PCs. But BitLocker makes it harder to boot into safe mode to protect your data because it encrypts the whole hard disk. So rather than just rebooting and tapping F8 to get into safe mode, you actually have to provide a code to get into a BitLocker encrypted volume in safe mode, which means recovery times were longer. Now, of course, we saw the joke that Southwest Airlines was not impacted because, and I kid you not, their system still runs on Windows 3.1, 3.1 for life, baby. But I don't understand how people can take a look at this and say, oh, haha, I run Linux, so this isn't my problem. I got news for you folks. CrowdStrike does make a Linux application, and Linux systems running CrowdStrike were affected. So this is a bigger problem, and it speaks a lot to software development, not just to the way that companies consume it. Because like you said, CrowdStrike did not test this. And given the fact that the person who's at the helm of CrowdStrike right now was tangentially responsible for an outage 15 years ago, it has a lot of people asking questions about how software development is done, and this idea that we have to push because we have to show value so that companies will continue to use our subscription services, as opposed to taking the time, slowing it down, making sure that this is right so that we don't have issues. If this had been CrowdStrike deploying an emergency patch because there was a massive 0-day that was found in their kernel, I would have totally been okay with the fact that, we had to get this out to save some, but in order to save some, we had to knock some others offline. But this was just like a random Thursday night push. And even though we saw it starting to roll out, I mean, the Register had coverage of this at like 2 a.m. US time. The fact that it rolled so quickly and we had no counter for it because it happened while we were asleep makes me wonder if we need a better solution, because really, to me, it sounds like automation allows us to fail faster with bigger explosions.
Another thing, Tom, I want to get to is what you mentioned about the EU. So there was a lot of talk about from Microsoft about how this wouldn't have happened if they had not been restricted by the EU and required to allow companies like CrowdStrike to use the kernel. As you point out, it is perhaps technically important for applications like CrowdStrike to run in or near the kernel level. I think that it's possible that Microsoft could have come up with an abstraction that would have allowed companies not to have a kernel mode process for this sort of technology. In fact, that's what Apple has been doing with Mac OS quite a lot. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the latest versions of Mac OS have eliminated kernel extensions and third-party software running in the kernel. They've also done a lot to harden the operating system, to cryptographically secure the operating system to make sure that there's no malware touching it. Now, that doesn't make Mac OS inherently secure, but it does make it less susceptible to issues and errors like this. So Microsoft was claiming, and I feel like this was kind of a disingenuous thing, they were claiming that this is really the EU's fault. See, if only you had allowed us to block things from the kernel, none of this would have happened. Well, as you pointed out, that's not entirely true, because the case that they're pointing to was a case where they were going to use Microsoft Defender in the kernel and force all competing products out of the kernel. So that would have given Defender an unfair advantage in the security market. And frankly, as you point out, Windows Defender is not without flaw and not without issues like this happening to it. So sure, would it have prevented this CrowdStrike error from blue screening all these PCs around the world? Yeah. Would it have prevented anything like this ever possibly from happening? Heck no. This sort of thing could happen a lot. We talked about this actually yesterday. I was a guest on the TechStrong Gang. You'll see me most Tuesdays on the TechStrong Gang at TechStrong TV. And we talked about this in detail, but I really don't feel that this is an appropriate line of conversation or defense for Microsoft. The fact that the EU blocked them from blocking third parties from the kernel is technically related, but that's not the cause of this issue. And using an issue like this as a way to try to push back on laws and regulations like the EU's is really, frankly, kind of cynical. It really isn't, it doesn't hold water from a technical perspective. It doesn't hold water from a legal perspective. Frankly, it just looks like a lot more, he said, oh no, look over there, it wasn't our problem. When honestly, what Microsoft could have said, frankly, was this wasn't our problem. CrowdStrike didn't test their thing. They pushed a bad update and it crashed our systems. Sorry, that's just how it is. I'm not pointing a lot of fingers at Microsoft here, because in this particular case, I don't feel like they are the ones at fault, which means that I don't think the EU is really the one at fault here either.
I completely agree. And I'll go a step further. It's not just cynical of Microsoft, it's absolutely hypocritical. Do you know why? Because they would absolutely allow their software to run at ring zero if they could get away with it. Do you remember back in the 90s when they had a whole lot of undocumented function calls that were happening in win.ini in Windows 3.1 that allowed Microsoft Word to load faster than WordPerfect? That almost got their entire organization broken up under an antitrust ruling. And it was only by, divine intervention at the last minute that didn't happen and allowed Microsoft to grow to the point that it is today. Do you know why Apple is able to get away with having severe restrictions on the way their kernel operates? Because Apple's software has to follow the same restrictions. That's the difference. The EU is not blocking you from doing this because it's only right that everybody gets to run at ring zero. The EU is saying that your applications and the third-party applications need to have the same privileges. So if you will let Defender run in ring one or wherever it needs to run so that it doesn't crash the kernel, then I bet you can get CrowdStrike out of your kernel too. So stop talking out of both sides of your mouth, and let's not ignore the fact that you guys had an outage before this ever started. If it hadn't have been for CrowdStrike, you would have been the top story this week, because a Microsoft Azure outage is always a big deal. It just so happened that your few thousand systems that went offline for a little bit first thing in the morning, which, let's be fair, were probably a harbinger of the actual CrowdStrike deployment, although we're not entirely sure, because doing the DFIR on that thing is going to be a nightmare for months to come. You dodged a bullet. And like Steven said, you should have stood up and said, terrible things happen. We did this in the name of security. It's not an operational problem with Windows. Trying to pass the buck makes you look about as bad as the CrowdStrike CEO right now. Everybody needs to do better. Everybody needs to wash their hands and take a long, hard look at the way that we do this stuff. And I do want to make a special shout out to the person who left a really stupid comment on Satya Nadella's LinkedIn update all about this, where he's talking about the fact that this is a violation of zero trust. You're as much a problem as the rest of us because you don't understand what zero trust actually does. Zero trust has nothing to do with kernel execution and things like that. Zero trust, as we know it, is a way that users interact with applications and least privilege and things like that. Once you get inside of ring zero, it doesn't matter anymore. There's no trust boundaries. Everybody's sitting at the same table doing the same stuff. It's on the developers to make sure that they write the correct code that won't crash things. And it's up to the operating system developers to pull up their big boy pants and decide that they're going to have to change the way that they operate their operating systems to prevent this from happening in the future, instead of blaming everybody else for problems that, quite honestly, they're perfectly capable of solving. All right, now I'm going to get off my soapbox.
It's okay, Tom. You can. I know this is a particular soapbox for you. One last thing that I would like to point out too is this was not a security issue. This was a stability issue. I've seen a lot of people, because CrowdStrike is in the security space, automatically make the jump and call this a cybersecurity incident. It was not a cybersecurity incident. In fact, the fact that CrowdStrike is pushing out updates prevents cybersecurity incidents, and this probably didn't expose these systems to any additional cybersecurity threats. In fact, again, once the proper update was applied, it protected those systems from threats. So there again, I think that it's important to recognize that while a massive outage that caused global calamity for multiple industries is a really bad thing, running systems without malware protection is a far worse thing.